Chapter 3, Pariah. Let me tell it now that I think of it. Frankly, I think of it often, for it shocked me and left a mark. His death affected the development of my character, so I consider it worth recording, though I appreciate that it was part of a greater story. Thus, it is worth recording in any case, according to the rationale that I set to decide which stories should be included here and which are surplus. I didn't realize it at the time. At the time, it was just a shocking thing. I was 23. It was late in the day, getting dark. It was summer. Though even summer was murky in Queen Mab. And the twilight that settled on the Maison Dieu was always ugly. I had gone down to the locker to fetch a las pistol to practice with. Some bottles on a wall. That's all I intended. Mentor Sauer had been critical of my marksmanship, saying that I lacked the hit rate of Corlem and Faria, and even to think Raud, who was just 15. Also, I had just clumsily finished a function in the Iron Quarter where it would have been useful to shoot better. I had got no. That story is certainly surplus here. I need to practice my pistol shooting. That's what matters. I had seen people die, let's be clear. Queen Mab is a violent city. I had even seen fights. I had seen deaths. I had been obliged to draw or improvise. I had inflicted injury. It is entirely possible I caused wounds that had led to death, or that my stray shots had, on occasion, slain some wretch I wasn't aware of. But I had not seen death like this. The drill was lit. The Maison Dieu was generally lighted by wick lamps and candles, by old glow globes embedded in the ceiling panels. The globes were stained yellow with age and hissed when they burned. In some hallways, we left out sticks or mop handles to strike the roof and jar them back into luminescence as required. The drill was lit. Glow globes shone like sickly suns. I went in to ask Mentor Sauer to reset my cuff so I could bypass the pain door and take the pistol from the locker. The drill was lit. I heard grunts of exertion and thought Mr. Sauer might be honing his blade craft. I didn't know of any candidates who would be training with him, but he was fighting with someone. They were fighting on the secondary ring, a canvas stage beside and slightly below the main sparring ring with its wooden railings. To the left were the practice dummies, and a row of Pavus shields and ceramite bucklers hanging on pegs. To the right were the two mechanical sparring machines, switched off and dormant, limbs raised in focus like rearing spiders. I saw drops of blood flecked on the wooden railings, and the small pool tracked in a smear across the canvas of the secondary ring, like a guilty red arrow pointing to them. And I realized it wasn't a sparring session. The man was breathing hard. He was blond and fairly young, and no, Sauer first. Sauer is more important to this story. And I realize I have done little more than mention his name so far. Mentor Sauer, Thaddeus Sauer, teacher of combat craft and measures of defense. He was tall and bulky. He was a daunting man, and I always thought of him as a solid, compacted, as if he were wrought from a denser material than normal people, like that of a neutron star. His mouth was an axe groove, his nose a flattened stump, His eyes were small and heavily lidded, as if they had evolved to protect themselves, like the eyes of a crocodilian. He was all function, shaved, clipped, trimmed, undecorated, but his hair was a thick crown of white that hung down to his brow and ears. It was not a distinguished silver light, like elder statesmen. It was yellow white and lusterless, like parched straw or dirty snow. His teeth were small, and he had no little finger on his left hand. Until I met Death Row, he was the most physically intimidating man I'd ever seen. I had no idea of his age. He was old, a veteran of military service. He had a slight podge, but that was just the inexorable spread of maturity rather than the lack of fitness. He was brutally strong and viciously fast. As ever, he was dressed in an armored body glove, boots and gauntlets, all oxblood red. His working clothes. So, the other man, he was younger and slighter, blonde, plainly good looking in a well-bred way. He was wearing the garb of the Anamnic Mercantanium, boots and breeches, heavy wool, underrobes, and a winter coat of some quality, its collar raised and lined with gazelle fur. Someone would dress. Oh, he was dressed the way someone would dress if they had to make a close and considered study of Queen Mob's merchant classes in order to pass as one. I do not know what small detail betrayed this to me, but I knew it in a second. Perhaps it was because I have essayed similar feats of disguise many times. Hold on a second. The terrorist is terrorizing. Little terrorist. You don't belong in there. They were fighting with short swords. Winter Sour was brandishing the thick twin-edged kutro that he always kept at his side. His opponent, the stranger, should not have been any kind of match for him in terms of bulk or skill or speed, but he was holding his own. In fact, he was doing better than that. Sour always carried a snub auto pistol in the back of his belt, and I saw that weapon lying on the floor quite some distance away from them. Sour's right forearm was cut behind the wrist, and the body glove sleeve was sliced open and flapping. He had drawn first and been disarmed by a sword thrust. It had only become a blade duel when Sour had been deprived of his pistol. The stranger was wielding a curved salatanir, or short saber, which I presumed he had brought with him. It was not a local weapon, not even local to the world. He knew how to use it. Besides the disarming wound, he had nicked Sour on the cheek and left shoulder. Sour was going for the face each time. From practice bouts, I knew this to be the way. It is a particularly invasive approach and can provoke rash reactions that led to failures of technique. One is hardwired to guard one's face, to focus attack, to focus the opponent to fight not only you, but his own automatic responses as well. Sour was trying to undermine the stranger's technical control. He was failing. I thought that was remarkable. No one beat Sour. Not in any form of combat. Then I thought almost simultaneously, why? Why are they fighting? Why is this man here? Blood had been drawn. This was no practice session, no combat lesson for a private client. The speed of the exchange blows was ferociously rapid. The stranger was putting everything through his blade and defending with deft footwork, opening the space when he could, staying side on to minimize his profile as a target. Sour was trying to keep it tight, trying to close the reach, deflecting the stranger's thrusts with his sword, and the middle band stitched to the forearms of his left sleeve. He maintained a face-on stance so he could play in both sword and armored sleeve. Sour was dogged. He tried to use his armored sleeve as an offensive weapon, occupying the stranger's sword so he could lunge in with his kutro. When he jabbed, I thought he had killed the stranger right away because the short sword's edge sliced through the man's chest. But the stranger rotated and came away fast, cutting down and back with his salatanir to deter Sour from follow-through. I saw that the stranger's very fine winter coat had been cut open, so that the left lapel rolled away, and the robe beneath it was sliced too. I glimpsed beneath that the wire mesh of an armored body glove. The stranger was not as soft as he looked. Sour was perhaps dismayed to discover that the stranger was discreetly armored. His killing blow would not have been so sure otherwise. He fumbled slightly, trying to reposition, trying not to lose the upper hand. The stranger caught him across the side of the head. I heard the crack of metal on flesh, the sound of an axe smacking through a ripe tuber. Sour's head snapped aside, his body rotating after it. Blood flew. It was in his dirty white hair. He crashed backwards into the railings of the upper ring and knocked over a spit bucket. He half fell, yet somehow kept his feet. But he was done. The stranger followed in, the salatanir going for the throat while his opponent's guard was dropped. You have to remember the speed. You have to appreciate, as I tell you this, that virtually no time had passed at all since I first entered the room and saw them fighting. 3, 4 seconds. Enough time for them to trade 24 blows. I had come in with just enough time to grasp the basic situation and see Sour fall. I never liked Thaddeus Sour. It's safe to say my feelings toward the cruel bastard were stronger and more negative than that. But he was of the Maison Dieu, and so was I. I started forwards. I shouted out a great cry and snatched a buckler from the pegs. My cuff was turned to dead, so the force of my bluntness came with me and my shout. It came like a slap to have a pariah come at you, aggressive, unlimited. To have a non-sensitive, a regular human, the psychic null of a blank mind can be disturbing, if only fleeting. The stranger recoiled. It was enough of a surprise to stop him cutting out Sour's throat. My interruption wasn't going to stop there. I hurled the buckler like a discus. The small, circular-shaped shield missed him, but he was obliged to duck. Sour was far from finished. He kicked out savagely and caught the stranger on the side of his thigh with his heel, throwing the man sideways, clumsily. The stranger landed, hands on the canvas, but he was ready as Sour propelled himself forward and kicked the mentor's legs away. Sour slammed back on his back. I was, all this time, still running at him. I turned into a flying kick. He rolled under me, flat to the floor, and sprang up as I landed and turned. I think he wanted to say something, but he didn't know what. Perhaps he wanted to tell me to flee, to back away from the fight. I had no part in it, but he couldn't. He wanted Sour dead, and he had to kill me too, or the whole house would come down on his head. I could sense his conflict. Unarmed as I was, I drove at him, using his reluctance against him. Fighting Sour was one thing, but he didn't want to engage a young woman. His response was half-hearted. He tried to shove me away. He tried to spare me his blade, though it was still in his hand. I think he hoped to clip me with the hilt or pommel, or perhaps knock me out. I would not let him off so easily. I grasped his wrist, turned it, and, with my other hand, punched the pressure point in his upper arm. The salatanir flew out of his deadened fingers. "Who are you?" I demanded. He rammed me aside with both hands. I staggered and fell. knocking down a rack of wooden exercise staves. I got up, gripping one stave, and kicking the others out of my way. The stranger was backing away from me, his hands up. He doubled up as Sour's Kutro tore into him from behind. The short sword went through his coat, through his robes, through his underjack and mesh, and sliced into his waist. Sour ripped the blade free, and blood squirted across the canvas. The stranger stumbled away, his head wobbling like a drunkard's, his feet unsure, his eyes confused. He had both hands clamped to his waist, but even tight together, they could not stop the hole in him. Blood poured out, like red wine from a jug. His hands and sleeves were soaked in it. He fell down to his back. Sour just stood there, watching him bleed out, the bloodied Kutro at his side. Blood formed a huge, dark red mirror in the canvas around the stranger. The mirror crept out. Blood soaked his coat and robes, covered his hands, and flecked his face. He stared at the ceiling, his mouth fluttering open and shut, his legs twitching. I bent over him. Perhaps he didn't have to die, I thought. We could hold him, bind him, call for the city watch. I tried to apply pressure to his ghastly wound, but it was open, as big as a dog's mouth. He stared at the ceiling, his mouth fluttering open and shut, his legs twitching. I bent over him. He finally saw me instead of the ceiling and lights. He blinked, refocused. Tiny beads of blood lodged in his eyelashes. What is this? Who are you? I asked. He said a word. It came out of him like a gasp, more than a sound. It was a word I had not heard before. He said, Cognite. There was a bang right in my ear, and it made me jump because it was so sudden, close, and painfully loud. A bark of pressure clouded me along the noise. I flinched as bloody back splutter hit my face, throat, and chest. I had his blood in my eyes. Mr. Sour put another round through the stranger's face for good measure, and then holstered the snub pistol.